아래 당도 저게 당도 지방에 받은 남친이 내 집에서 최마도 봐 관계자 편반 매봐서 최코나 아마도 민도 대자다 최냠내 지긴 선배 삼르게 되다 안 도시네 자 냠내 제 삼다야체 안디야는 좀 거소래 델리아 디니게 삼로디 약고게야 안 소사 집자체 라마다이 타나 라마 이담리야 내 소와다 안디네 소소라한 게 내 베주지 준주지지 냠는 시고레스 디네 냠는 제바이나 안다디기에 각보레 로자타마 고고레 선배 삼로 지여베이나 안디네기 고 뒤시세디 는 교어저 겐나 규단 겐레 되는 교어저에서 소수기 규겐 안데 소놈 사바다 디네 제베네 안 냠는 대하고 이게 용도 그레스 전에 다던다 인보딩한테 디르쇼베 디고 마시거로.
Good afternoon. So in brief this morning, having concluded looking at the certainty of our death and the uncertainty of the time of death, we then have come to look at that at the time of death, all these pleasures and problems that we've engaged in over our lifetime are of no benefit. All these worldly endeavors are of no benefit. All that matters is accumulating the Dharma, strengthening virtuous imprints, and breaking non-virtuous imprints. So therefore, I make the decision to apply myself to the Dharma and the Dharma alone. We also then looked at this morning how in order for one's meditation to go well, one must start each session with making sincere supplications to one's Lama and Yidam, and then engage in a process of accumulation and purification before settling down into the meditation, following the various lines of reasoning, and doing so repeatedly over a sustained period. And have confidence, take heart that, as we saw this morning, all conditioned things do not remain the same. So take heart. By applying yourself consistently over a sustained period, change will come.
다데네 먼저 그르송고스네 덴마 안 산지 유송 비게 송럽 탐제다 소소 냠렌 수자제 냠렌 두신 당고레스 내가 내레스나 다 데다르나 세되덴마 데다나 신인 덴바다 안 다저당 미다비오 고 송바 남 미다비오 고 남사 송럽 공제란 제바 강나 두경 갑대당 디 냠렌도 셰네 강나 안 제외 공부 될라도 네버 규르제 갑셴도야 데들 셰바 자오스.
Now we come to the final sub-outline in this chapter, which is how to carry out the practice of all the excellent teachings. So in the published book, it's in the middle page 89, and in the handout, it's in middle page 102. Thus, if you understand the way to practice reliance on a spiritual teacher, the freedoms and endowments and impermanence in the context of the scriptures and their commentaries, and if you sustain that, you will easily find the intention of the victor. In this way, you'll also understand them in other contexts.
데네 치와 미다비 코스 치와 미다비 송바 되게 차상 다데가 저기 람림 나마도 신데네 냠네 치와 송여와 데네 지게 송바 나신 제네다 변의 흉현대 상이 송가와 이내다 데네게 송럽 공제다 제발라서 기위 신이 고 송바이나 다 람림 나려야 기위 신이 곰나 냠네 치 가르지 어디 나신 제네 냠네 제고레스 아니 디나신 상이 송럽 현다 나려야 아니 아직 단주기 리딩 고 송바이나 지산 단주기 리딩 냠네 치다디 람림 나네 대시 송바 나신 지도 제고레스 지단 미다베 고 송바디기네 데네 치와 미다바 디네 삼도 소수 율레 자제 치와 미다바 삼도 두시네 냠네 제고레스 디네 제바이나 아니 미다베고 디네 송럽 공제라 제바 가나 두견 다 상이 송다 송 공제 다 지게 베제 가와 예바이나야 갑대다 냠네 두시네 냠네 자고레스 냠네도 냠내도 시에네 장나 서도 되네게 냠는지네 장바인데 제바이나 안에 계획 공부 대라도 녀버 주스기 제가 송라기 공부되게 안에 람사 네 야고지네 야고 뼈고하고 두고 그래서 대라도 녀버 주스 어디 봐도
So it starts with the word thus. So this then is the link to what has come before. Now, the thus here, we can understand that it refers to both that we have completed looking at this topic, the impermanence of this life. But as we'll see from what is about to follow, it also refers to that we've completed looking at what is our very foundation for our training. So the text, Lama Tsongkhapa continues. Thus, if you understand the way to practice reliance on a spiritual teacher, the freedoms and endowments and impermanence, so this then refers to the three major topics that Lama Tsongkhapa has presented thus far. So we've looked at all of these. So for example, with precious human rebirth, we saw there that it has various outlines, such as a rebirth such as this is rare because it is so difficult to attain. Yet it has incredible meaning. There's a great purpose this precious human rebirth can achieve. So these were some of the parts that we looked at within that chapter. Lama Tsongkhapa continues. Impermanence in the context of the scriptures and their commentaries, and I've just changed the next line a little, and if you then sustain, so the word can be translated as nurture, but sustain is better, sustain that, you'll easily find the intention of the victor. So here Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, if you understand well these three topics, then this is your foundation, your basis for your training. When you encounter other teachings by the Buddha or commentaries on what the Buddha has taught, you will not find these topics presented in a way that is different. There may well be a difference in the sequence that a particular text presents the trainings, but if you understand that these three are the foundation, and why so? The foundation to enter into the Dharma practice, and you sustain this what you've understood in your training. So what we had there in the first line, if you understand the way to practice. So if you take what you've understood in these three topics and you integrate it in a sustained manner in your practice, you will come to understand the intent or the intention of the victor, of the Buddha.
Date Geshe Thubten Rabten dene kama be song daya de jisan disu du song jege ti chasan du chine song dene mira song ge de donda sam dang de yang ju ge da chi we che chema do xie gang ge pan do me ba che ba xi de pan do ye ba de che ji bu le sem be sam lo de le ba jia jin chasan du nyam le ji go le se ji de shu mong bu ji su zhang ba ba din na jian da be ne do da dian jue dang That you umeke tension nalia, parching nalore, and the Shumangbe nalia, and the Midabe gorge, Gasore, Ben the danger or Sung Yubayena, Chesa Disvaton and the Lamsa, and Lamrim so big Dajinia Gava, the Dunchevadike, some danger, Dulpacha Gores, Dushin Jagore said. Chesa Gana, Dukia Sirwa, Sundra, Gondela, Jeba, Gawa Yenang, Diniki City, the Nadic Sunguna, Captain. Kap Tibetan di nyamlen de cha di kap sheba dige nyamlen le cha so so ki nyamlen ki wi shin de so le cha ya dang ne ju ge dun chen kong ba le cha ya de ne chi o me ta be ko sam na ko de le ya cha chen do s nyamlen che ba ina de ne do dang kong de tham ji ge don da ning bo dige cha sa du ne nyamlen che shin go le s do shen che go le sa che sa do shin ne song do nyamlen de xie ne yang na ge yu kong ba de la de nya ba ji ge yu song ra ki don da cha sa ha gu go le s
So this morning we saw we came to the conclusion of Lama Tsongkhapa's presentation on impermanence, where the very culmination of this chapter is the determination, the decision, I will practice only the Dharma. Whatever I'm engaging in, my mind will be on the Dharma, and thereby I will be engaging in Dharma practice. And Lama Tsongkhapa made this point also by bringing in supporting quotations, as he does. No quotations from Potawa, from Dulpa, and Kamapa. So there are these three supporting quotations, and we see there that when one draws in from other parts of the Dharma, other commentaries in this case, or even sutras, that we will find no contradiction in what Lama Tsongkhapa has presented, but rather that they are complementary, because this is the very meaning of the Dharma, the very intent of the victor. Moreover, as one continues in one's education and training, one will receive commentaries on sutras, as well as two commentaries on sutras. And they will be on a variety of topics. Whatever topic they are, they won't contradict what has been presented here. Moreover, it's only because of the achievement of this basis, of these three topics, of this foundation, that you will engage in any other topic later. So if whether one's receiving teachings, for example, on the middle way, whatever it may be, you can only receive that teaching because you have a precious human rebirth, and because you have a spiritual teacher guiding you. And moreover, because you have this precious human rebirth and are being guided by a spiritual teacher, you have also come to reflect on emptiness and on impermanence, and thereby have come to recognize the impermanence of this life, and actually all that has value is the Dharma, and therefore this is what I will apply myself to. So that third decision. So it's because of this foundation of these three subjects that one is able to engage in any future Dharma topic. And in this way, we come to recognize that every realization in the Dharma comes about in dependence on this foundation.
제사다 람림 나르마 냠렌제 짐바 방림 진바 방당보 디데 당보의 기위 신인데스 공고레 디젤야 나중에 된지 채와데 공고레 디검체절라 안에 치와메다보 공고레에서지 방림진 소요로다 공나고 셔서 소요로 짐바진 소 진짜 흉현다 나려야 우마다 파진 흉 몽보나려야 데니기 방림만 매바시 안에 가브리엘에 미다고 고송교 몽보가 가브리엘에 다지 고송야 가브리엘이야 기위 신인데스 고송요로 와다 그래서 소야디게 양직 두신에 시설 마선 데스 갈강좀 유간절 송고르와 지상 군주 고투고르와 당한조 리에 당보질레 데니신의 고투고 말 매바자 당보 냠내님 바딜레 다시 인텐소장 데니 다주기 되시자 데니 미체와 미다바데 공부고리 에사제 냠내기 짐바 공나 송르와 다 데니 송바자 다 데니게 냠내체도 다 흉이šan다 가와나를 두스다이도 미다베 거선 통연나 제자다 다디디 만저 또 람림나 소바나 냠네 지다나 소솔이야 도시 미다고 거삼 당쇼스 데네 아니 신이게 된소이 되네 송여바나 디곰타디 도시인다 람림 소마나 다라레 도시는 공부고리에서 송거로도나 인보데
As each of you know well, the Lamrim is presented in a particular sequence of trainings, and the sequence starts with relying on the spiritual teacher and is followed by the recognition of our freedom and endowments, or attainment of them and their great value, and then followed by impermanence. So this is the sequence of trainings in the Lamrim, but it is not the sequence as presented in many other texts, especially ancient texts. So if one is looking at sutras or commentaries to sutras, such as texts on the topic of the middle way view, or those of the ornament of realization, so the various perfections, there often one will come across that the chapters are not presented in the same sequence as we find in the Lamrim. But if you have reflected well on these three, whenever this topic, or these topics rather, come up in other texts at a different place, topics of relying on the teacher, impermanence, precious human rebirth, you will see that whatever is composed is complementary to what's here in the Lamrim and not contradictory. But secondly, and more importantly, for you to be able to actually engage in the main topic as presented in other texts, you require this foundation. Because as we saw at the previous point, that this is the foundation. These three topics are the very foundation for the path. So therefore, for us as beginners, and beginners in the sense of we still aspire to cultivate a path within, we have yet to cultivate a path within, it is imperative that we train in these three topics. This is the foundation by which we will be able to successfully engage in every other topic of the Dharma.
지난데 기위신 템페 팬 삼 템페 템바이나 팬 삼다 메템바이나 소소자 두시나네 용을 받아 마딘바이나 기위신 최투구말 최마토바네 소소던다 신말 마신바다 소소기 냠는 제신말에 선비기다 퇴베 최신 템페 팬 삼다 마딘비기 예미 삼다 템바이나 팬 가서 라메스네 최슈 라메제 최슈네 최퇴야도 랑이 don다 신그리 don다 신바나 소소기 냠는 제신그리 냠는 제신바나 소소기 동화바야다 아니 가소래 타르바다 탐지kin 보고 뭐들 냠네도 쭉 두고 어래 선배기 두섬다베나 예비신 된속에 평연섬 띵배 평연다 매딘배 예미섬 대시 섬다 되네 섬다네 당한서 예비신 될이야 예비신 유구송 투수 연된 제제 안지게 랑게 예비신 연된 같이 전 투구가 받을 같이 제제 전바다 안 예비신 구연된 순구연된 투유연된 안지게 잠니제 제연된 캠베연된 뉴베연된 뒤단 남바군다 아니 신화지의 최대 도시는 현래 판바장야 줍두고 와요 세베 되네게 삼다 개위신이 연된 대제 대레데제 대바제시도 제 고미야디 다니 맞아 개위신이 검수 직차고 되네게 되네 안 개위신인데 랑리야 최대 니지 개위신이 랑리야 제요 원게 랑라 최대 되네게 배제 콜베 동알을 줘야다 탈바다 탐지킨 보고 토비하게 돈달이야 냠내 림바 때문에 빼마스 깨진 친구인다 딜을 하바지 나라 깨지 매버레스 제사다 안주 타야디 띵기 대와 토비하래 뭐에 동아들이 제사다 내려 동알에 타야 띵기 대와 토야 탈바 탐지킨 보고 때문에 빼마스 깨진 친구인 삼제 누전에 남이 깨지 연된 템베 돈에 라마를 대바 제시도 곰 남이기 소설에 최된 바디 제 깨진 제수 템베고네 라마로 구바 침베 곰바디다 개위신인데서 곰세데 곰수디 디차디가래 다장은 도시는 차 되네에서다 맞아 제 되네 곰네 다 뒤다 남바콘도 개위신이야 안시 록바 제 균주의 삼노도 싸우기네 마코와 뒤다 남바콘도 개위 제 균주의 삼바디 남야 기주메 아 선비 삼다 송야디다 또 송제 도시는 삼다이다 개위신인데서 곰수디제 안 되네게 제일이야 안 뒤사위제래 안 뒤다 남바콘도 개위신인데 다 그디나 가나 슈바텔이야 안 사람네 세르버도 상기고 마도게 봐도 라마키 유구용어서 궁외기다 로마제 궁어수제 라마진의 최용어수 슈이제 냠내진의 타라 안 상기고 봐 토버쇼 선비 다 몰람게야다 도시에디 당도 개위신인데서 곰수디 돌디슈베네 디차고래 개위신인데서 곰수디
When we looked at the first topic of the Dharma as presented, as referenced here, the how to rely on a spiritual teacher, there we came to gather knowledge, and then that knowledge was to be integrated. And the meditation, based on the knowledge gathered, was to look at, firstly, the benefits of relying on a spiritual teacher and the faults of not doing so. And the purpose of that part of the reflection was to make it very clear, I need to rely on a teacher. And if one comes to this determination of I need to rely on a teacher, then this means one will rely on them in the way they are guiding you to. That is the very essence of, or the very meaning of, relying on someone. You rely on their guidance. So when one was reflecting on the benefits of relying on a spiritual teacher, many were listed, but it really comes down to this, by relying on a spiritual teacher, I will gain knowledge of the Dharma. And not only will I understand the Dharma intellectually, but I will gain understanding of how to cultivate it within. So that by relying on a teacher, I will be guided in terms of both acquiring knowledge and the method by which to cultivate that knowledge. And in my ongoing process of cultivating that knowledge, I will gain ongoing guidance as to the success and how to overcome the obstacles that I'm experiencing. And having reflected now on the benefits of relying on a teacher, I will rely on that advice and implement it as given. Moreover, through doing so, the great benefit that will be attained is that through coming to understand the cause of my suffering, afflictions, and how to eradicate them, the antidotes, and applying myself to that, I recognize the change that's coming within. And therefore, I can recognize, actually, I am progressing towards liberation and enlightenment. This is becoming within reach for me. Moreover, in the meditation, having reflected on benefits of relying and faults of not doing so, one then recalls the many excellent qualities of one's spiritual teacher, those that he enacts through his physical conduct, those of his speech and particular teachings, and those mental qualities that he displays through how he conducts his life and how he imparts teachings, recognizing his incomparable wisdom, love, compassion, and so forth. The third step of the meditation, the first two being benefits and faults, and the second being qualities. The third then is to recognize the tremendous kindness that he brings through his very presence. And his kindness in particular comes down to guiding us to come to recognize our own potential, come to know ourselves or come to know our mind well, and thereby come to know that we can achieve enlightenment. In fact, through continuing to follow his guidance, enlightenment is within reach. That's the third meditation, that on kindness. And this then leads to the conclusion of the meditation, which is recognizing his incredible qualities and kindness and the benefits of relying on him. So those first three steps. When faults in the teacher appear to my mind, I'm not going to dwell on them, whether those are just a delusion in terms of something I completely constructed, or whether there are those faults. Doesn't matter. I'm going to put them aside, and I'm going to rather focus on his many excellent qualities rather than perceived faults. Moreover, I will strive to rely on him in the way that is guiding and make the greatest offering possible to him, the one offering that really interests him. And that is, I will follow his guidance and cultivate the Dharma within in the way I'm being guided to. And I'll make prayers and supplications to him, accumulate virtue, purify non-virtue, and then meditate in the way that he's guiding me. And in this way, I can have confidence I will achieve the final stages of training, because that is his very heart wish, that I attain enlightenment.
Di gom che yane yado gom yane yado gom deni ge lo di danga zo nyuba charata deni ge lo di gom che jema mayin ba jinga gyule gigyo ba ina da giwi lamrin no sobe giwi shin den su gom be giwi shin den su ge tobo gyule ge wa cha go da ko tobo gyule ge wa le sa de je za deni jema mayin ba chi go wa da deni ge jema me be ge wa la an zo ge gom ya di je ge mi je 가시네 로직 gom ga cha go de 가시네 me ji mi so ge ne wong po lo ba be ge that ne lo komyare denege dawa komyare shaba khajna um delion sigirwa ondu sinme nyamlen batike da lamrim nyamlen nangandige denege lo selba je lo da dawa da kaze komgona dusine gynubuji do komgora deji shohe kama be somadi la yanja komsho sengamadi yanja komkore sedi dirwadi andushi suman dusine komne da jemma mai bishke bayna da gewishin densogi 당아서 람림 소be topati gyule geware saji sha chugo ware
And furthermore, the meditation isn't something to be engaged in from time to time, nor should, even if one has a continuous, a regular meditation practice, one shouldn't move from topic to topic. But if one really has the wish to transform one's mind, one needs to follow the advice that Kamawa gave, which is stay with that topic until it arises in a manner that is uncontrived. Then it has been realized. So in the case of relying on the spiritual teacher, one reflects on the incredible qualities of one's teacher so as to generate faith, and reflects on his great kindness so as to generate respect. And by meditating on these points again and again and again, eventually they will arise in an uncontrived manner. So for some, this will take an intense effort over a period of months, others a period of years. However long it takes, one should stay with that topic until the transformation comes in a manner that's uncontrived. And for the reason for some it will go more quickly than for others is only down to the vast number of interconnected causes and conditions that are required to bring about change. Some of those need to be cultivated now. Others, we're relying on imprints from lives previous to this. This is why for some it comes, realizations come about more quickly and others take a bit longer. The length of time isn't important. Applying oneself skillfully, repeatedly over a sustained period in the way advised, this is how transformation will come for everyone. The training in this first point like this, and training successfully to the point where it arises in an uncontrived manner, then from that you can understand the impact that every meditation on that meditation, when it is on subsequent topics, which always starts with heartfelt supplication and prayer to one's Lama and Yidam, and then the accumulation of virtue and purification. How powerful that is. Because one has cultivated an uncontrived realization of relying on the spiritual teacher. Then when one starts the meditation session on another topic of the Dharma, starts it with relying on the spiritual teacher, that will open one's mind to transformation.
And Parasende dajugi tin telya ngajugi chosa tripja tarbata kiwa chima ondio goba thoya gyune dajugi lutin tel truptugore tarbata tamje kimbo goba nyamlen kada chebana tin tel truptugudu sembe dushene da dinige samdaje dönchembo truptuba ima hagowa je dia gocha hago dine hagone telya다 디링이 dajugi dönchen lutin toba telya an지 nyamle yagochi sembe다 dajugi tin 개침보딩에 저 철라마다와지 디텐델량에 디봉케를 냠내 야보치 선배 삼다에 당한주 내주된신 삼다에 시작으로 와다 되네기 제가 되네기 삼다에 되네기 두제 대야 지금 아주게 나주의 개침보 임바드베 즉 두수 삼야네 야도 삼다에 나주 된체와다 아니 녀가와다 안지게 어두신 삼다에 되네기 텐델이야 된디 철라마다 된디 비주 야고다 냠내 야고치긴 선배 삼다에 당한주게 대주 된체 삼다에 되네기 삼다양직 인간주 된주 된체와 임 되네기 삼도 야도 당제 되네기 삼로디다 배 마스다 개침부 딜레 하바지 민도아 선배게 삼로 쥐마 많이 배니제 안데 델레야 안제 개죽지 마르네 탑민도 선배 삼로지 코 개외나 다 쥐마 많이 배기요도 다 대주 된신기 다 공비게 도바세야 차고로 받아 냠는데
The second topic, that is that of the precious human rebirth. There, at the very first point of the reflection, is to recognize just what we've achieved. So that's to come to recognize the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments, that I have attained all of these. So this is the first point of the meditation. Again and again, looking, yes, I have all of these qualities. And these qualities, now the second point, are not to be taken for granted because they are difficult to achieve. And I know they're difficult to achieve because of all the causes that were accumulated to lead to this rebirth. And also I know that they would have been difficult to achieve because of how few people have a fully qualified precious human rebirth. In fact, how few beings have such a rebirth. That's the second point. Then the third point of the meditation. This rebirth, upon the basis of this rebirth, I can achieve so much. This life has great potential. The very purpose of this life is that I can accumulate the causes that will definitely lead to my attainment of enlightenment for the sake of others. Becoming a bodhisattva for the sake of others. What's more important than that? I can do that on this basis. Therefore, one concludes the meditation with this recognition. I cannot let this opportunity go to waste. What I have is truly precious. It's rare, it's remarkable. I cannot take this for granted. I cannot come to the end of this life and look back with regret. Then one repeats this meditation repeatedly over a sustained period, keeping it in mind as well as one goes throughout one's day. And as this starts to arise in an uncontrived manner, one will walk around with this recognition of how incredibly fortunate I am. This is a mind that is both powerful, but it's also joyous, feeling like you've achieved the greatest of goals possible. And at that level, it certainly is. Just what we can achieve with this life. This makes the mind powerful and positive and strong. That is an indispensable mind to engage in all the meditation topics. But to get there, one goes through these meditations again and again, starting with recalling the presence or calling to mind the presence of one's teacher, making supplications, engaging in accumulation and purification. And then, in this case, the meditation on the precious human rebirth, recognizing what you've achieved, how difficult it was its great potential, and then the conclusion, I will not let it go to waste.
Chiwa midaba ko komnadi ang chiwa la chakpa kiba lo ki hoya jikna chiwe zu chwe ma to gangi ja pandu meba mepemba isa chwe je ko ba ta chwe ba sa di samdai re jina da chiwe je kaso chiwa la jikbi lo ki sa di gar so ko sanda de ma zu de ji denju lu din khebar chen dene ge duen chen bo thoba de di an chi ge da chiye ne nge ba re gidi chi nge ba me ba re jina da dene ge duen chen bo lu din khebar chen den delia 가리 냠는지나 제투에 띵 개발진 토바텔이야 미 안지 냠는지 맞제 받제 다들 냠는 시와지나 시와데 가투에 가요 말에 이내 마신 예려야 안지 녀마 디버사시베 디버디바 샤야다 아니 게호 주베디 제투에 지레 대자다 미 디니게 띵 고갑 야고 유디급리야 디니게 안지게 디버 샤야당 개와 마루베지 냠네 마지베 시선데 뺏사사레 디니자다 데니기 마신jel이야 디봉기로 때 제투바 지긴 선배 삼다에 대한 주게다 치와를 잡아기로 로세 자고로 가서 데니 치와를 잡아기수도 데니 시엘이야 냠는디 데니기 마제바 시선데 용치 모라사레 선배게 삼다에 되다 데니게 삼다다 삼다지 데니게 삼로 숙치 뭐 깨야 돼 유바치 뭐 깨고야 돼 다제 치와를 잡아기로 로세 자고로 와
When precious human rebirth has arisen within one in a powerful and transformative way, one then moves to the impermanence of this rebirth. Now, this is the chapter we're just concluding. Here the meditation has 4 steps, of which the first, the introductory step, is reflecting on the benefits of engaging in this meditation and the great loss of not doing so. And then the meditation is outlined as we've looked at in some detail, first coming to gain conviction that I will die. Just like all the other great practitioners have, so too will I. And when my life, the end of this life comes, there will be nothing that I can do. There's no medicine or practice that can be done to extend my life when my lifespan is up. And when my lifespan comes to an end is entirely uncertain. I have no certainty in how much remains of this life. My health, my age, these are guides, but they do not present anything certain. And when the time of my death comes, all that I've valued and striven to accrue in this life, relationships, possessions, and so forth, will not help me when my need is greatest. I am then at the mercy of my imprints, because my imprints alone that will accompany me into my next rebirth. That then leads to the conclusion. To summarize the three conclusions, I must practice the Dharma, and I must do so from right now, and I must only practice the Dharma. This is what needs to dominate my mind in whatever I am doing. So this then is the meditation on the impermanence of life, that as with each topic, one engages in repeatedly over a sustained period in and out of formal session, keeping it in mind. And one will, as with all the topics, start to experience change in one's way of thinking, seeing how, for example, the attachment to this life's pleasures and attachment, or aversion rather, to this life's problems starts to fade. And one starts to see the activities and concerns of this world as not being of much interest. And in fact, even a disgust towards the attachment to pleasures and aversion towards the problems arises. And in this way, one sees one's mind moving towards this uncontrived realization of impermanence. Really, this mind of an impermanence of death comes down to this stable determination that if my life ends before I've accumulated extensive virtue or habituated myself well to virtuous ways of thinking, and if it ends before I've weakened substantially my habituation to afflictions, this will be a grave loss. I will not let that happen. And it is that thought that we need to have ever present as we go about our life. In our meditations, between meditations, this thought that I must break my habituation to the afflictions, strengthen my habituation to wholesome minds. That is what we need to carry around with us. That needs to be our inner guide.
치워내봐 남친해봐 매봐 삼다지 가서래 가서 치위에 값수 자니 니도다 아니 베롱죄다 아니 저기 소리야 강의자 태야 매봐 계좌 매봐 인사다 제 개와 치말에 패디 다디 가서 치 최디 냠는 쳔마도 최디 냠는 마셔봐다 가야 민 최디 마도 민도 세서다 최 제가 개와 치말에 패디다 최디랑 레샤 스틱 패야 디마도 셴 치위에 값수 판도 여기 that you launch that bed and Kaya Mebaza, Geshe Sheba Najin Kaya, Church Buresha, something, then sometimes the church margin tap menu, some pedang, Chenyam that Mashibi, Yubi, Rindelia, then Jig, Gewachimali Pembe, Chediam, Jiggy, Sempe, Samlodi, Tachedi, that di, Samlodi, Yana Yando Comje, di Samlodi, Dangazus Comjen, the nigger Samlodi, Jumama in Bashikage, Gores, the Nichuma member Kevana Dangano. That chiwa mitape kapso that kasore chiwe ka chema to gangi mi phamba ta chi pe los jewa di chagore jezadi chiwe kapso chema to gangi yang ane pando me se jeza denege samlo di ta chi pe los de mando sambra cha se di yane ya do samda ko me di ta di re jeza chiwa mitape kapso samda ya de ya ma juge chiwa la ta pe lo je sa chi de ji shu ba che da chiwe kap chema to shin ye gangi 매반자다 최지바 타주고도 최응야바 제후인세 타주별로 깨야지 깨야지 니니데 차고도 또르지.
By reflecting on this topic repeatedly over a long period of time, a sustained awareness of the imminence and unpredictability of our death will arise. And accompanying this will be the ever-growing change in what we value. So our interest in the trivial activities of this life will diminish, and our concern to practice only the Dharma will become ever more dominant, recognizing that all that I would otherwise value so in my life, my relationships, my possessions, things that seem so indispensable, at the time of great importance, when this life is ending, they will be of no use. All that will then have an impact is the imprints I accumulated over this life. This then adds to this determination that nothing but the Dharma matters. So this is what we need to cultivate in our mind again and again and again. These three decisions that follow from each root. I must practice the Dharma and do so from now and only the Dharma. So that this serves to ensure that at all times we regard our mind, take care of our mind, so that it's not being influenced by the afflictions, but is rather virtuous. And by doing so, continuously, this realization of impermanence, the very gateway to genuine spiritual practice, will arise, and arise in an uncontrived manner, in a manner by which we cannot be swayed from engaging in what's important.
제사당 저 두스는 삼다베는 denju lyudien kombe kabla denju denchewa samdade denju denchemba didelya chwenyamle yabo jigin sembege samdaya jigridoa da de chiwala traba kibi losidega da denju lyudien dentelya nyamlen mashamba chisonda besasa de chwenyamle yabo jigin sembe samdaya chagdoa da dene da디 치외주 최마도 바 강의제 판도 매바자 게 최념len 제고도 좀 타주에 삼도 된다 숨가라 최념len 야고 제고도 선배기 된다 삼로디 야고도 깨고야 된다를 디리도 하다.
So it should be very clear, but this is what you need to carry in your mind, how these various topics they influence each other. They are not separate. And so this is why you need to cultivate the former, because it gives richness to the latter topics. So when one has realized the preciousness of this rebirth, one will know what I can achieve with this life. One will know I can really live a life of great meaning. Then that is what inspires the meditation on the impermanence, on death and impermanence, where we come to recognize just what we can achieve, but my time is limited. This misconception about this expanse of time that lies before me, this is a delusion. There's no certainty at all. I have to achieve the purpose of this life, and I need to, which is the first decision, and I need to do it from right now. The second decision, nothing else matters. In fact, everything else is a distraction from what is meaningful, what has value. So here we see very clearly how these meditations on the precious human rebirth and impermanence complement each other. And the latter comes about more quickly and in a more transformative manner, independent on our success in the prior cultivation of the previous points.
다도 신행은 삼단에 되네 아직 망보라 대소 삼로 디식기에 된다려야 안지 망보라 대세에 빼로제 망보제 시고 송요데 디로와 된다 삼로디 약고기에 된다려야 송고로 제자다디 냠는 최 냠네 저 같이 최지에게 되냐기 듬바 즉 되냐기 듬바디 빼마시다 가소래 좀 많이 바로시 기고고서 와다 디 냠는 제 된다라 되네 즉 그 빼다다 말하자는두순 김제 망보셔야 된다 디르도 되는 닝보디 최전마다 탑민도 최진지 제고도 선배기라 디 맞은데 지금은 선배 제 듬바 약고시게 돼 된다라디 송도와 대차사.
This too is why one needs to keep encountering the same topics to guard one's mind against the delusion of feeling a particular topic is maybe too introductory. I've heard this enough. I know it. This is a delusion. We need to hear what we have here, scriptures and the commentaries on the same topics again and again, because each time it reawakens our former understanding, as well as adding to our new understanding, and in particular, adding inspiration. Even if we aren't hearing anything for the first time, our inspiration will grow by engaging with the teachings with an open mind, an open heart. And moreover, we need to ensure that the way of thinking of the Dharma becomes ingrained in in who we are, which means we need continuous effort throughout the day, every day, letting go of what's unimportant, embracing what solely is important.
Atisha, Dadine ya disor, Dadi Yamlin Jegi, some of the Yahuki, Dondala, the Chiba Shagora, Dadin Ma, Karasungosune, Chidin Chimmer, Jidder, Gursus, Joaniki, they do some to Sheba Asura. Chidin Chima. The caption to say the Doshan that they do so, but they give a Jisung, she did Chiba that on Najiba.
So that then is the concluding line here. In this way, you'll understand them in other contexts. So continuing to gather knowledge, integrating that knowledge, and building on this foundation.
Yes, Jidin Chima. That in it, Jezadang Shine, Meva Togu Mares, Meva Togu Mares, Shine Kaudugosine, Geva Chima the Jogores, that Gemachiwa Drosa Delaya, and the young Wundukovan, Droyajida, Dendral Drojid, and Wandral Droyanima to your Mares, Jezada, Jidin Chima Drosu Yiki, they do some Sheba, said Jezang Andro. Then Andro Drobana do not in it in the Yore. Jezanda Dendral Gabanin, Dire, said Dendral Devat in the Yungure, said Jezada and Shido de Cabla, Meba Chagio Mare, Jidin Chima Drogores, Chima Drosa de la Nima to your Mares, Nandro than Dendro Nides, Jezada, Nandro Gabana, Carcara Yore, Kanga Carriore Session, that Dendro Gabana, and the Dungale, Diki Manga Duya, the Diki, Devat in it in the Yores, Deneza, Dini Dushi, Ma Sungore dish.
As we've seen in this chapter that we've just concluded, when this life ends, and it will, our body gets left behind, but our consciousness continues. We do not become non-existent. We do not cease to exist at death. We continue on, and we continue in one of two directions. So now we come to look at the first of those two directions, to understand what is to be expected should one happen to fall. First, we'll look at the lower realms, and then later we'll look at the higher realms. So the purpose of this new path that we come to is to understand the potential, or what potentially lies ahead of us.
Ngandre Dungagis, Ngandrigida, Ngandri Gabana, Nikaraka Yore, said the Dungatin Shore, said Digar shared to Niba ni, Deda, Denurdu, and a chiver and Abe, and the city long making, she ought to made a middle, Gawa Langueso, Deyan Droinile, Shen, Gesa maybe, and Dedrole. Dedroam, Ngandrikio, Yana dinner joy, and Ngandrikores. They are Rawa Meji, Legi, Shawa Jimbe, Karnagi, and Le Karnagi, Chidera, Pombashin Kios. That you are Chima in Jimmy drove over the Sura, that could be Kimsendi, the Sungwa.
So the second, at the new chapter, the contemplation of what will happen in future lives in terms of the happiness and suffering of the two types of persons. So this then starts to look at what happens for those who right now are experiencing the sufferings of the lower realms and what potentially could happen to us there. So Lama Tsongkhapa starts. And I've just changed a way of expressing the second line. The meaning is fine, it's just not so clear. Since it is certain that you will die soon, you have no time to tarry in this life, and after death you will not cease to exist. You must take rebirth, since apart from the two there is no other place of birth. You will be born in either the fortunate rebirths or the lower rebirths. In addition, since you are not under your own control, but under the control of something else, your karma, you will be reborn according to the virtuous and non-virtuous karma that impels you.
that the Jesa Niban, the new do chill, we said, the Sing of the Yel Shebana, the Chiwamita, Namching, Neva, Meva, Chiwangeba, the Roger, new to Chiwangeba, she a touch about it, Ningadishi, new to Chiwangeba, it said. Jesa that Chiwangeba and them, Cedi, Delon making, and Cedelia, Dabo Dimbush, Yomaris, that Debbie, Dusuroji, Yomaris, or that, King, she, King, the tis on the here was ordered. Jesa Delon babies. That she ought made the midway. She never check my was. She never check your marriage, made the midway, and Memazota, and yet gave us longer was, gave us longer was at this order. The
first sentence links very clearly to the topic we've just looked at. Since it is certain that you will die. So that was the first route which led to the decision, therefore I must practice the Dharma. Lama Tsongkhapa continues, you have no time to tarry in this life. So this is a reference to the second point of the previous chapter, that the uncertainty of our time of death. Therefore, one doesn't have time to delay or linger in this life. One doesn't have the time to delay or to linger in this life. One needs to apply oneself to the Dharma.
These are done. Kewalango Bazan, Kewalana Kadilangoresan, Drawani Lake, Geshe maybe, Geshe maybe. And she's a Kewalin said the Kewalingo Bazan, Kewalin said the Nima to Yoma, Drawani, Nando de Dendro Nima to Yomares, maybe, and Dido Am, Nando Kyo, Siana, Nando Kiori, and the Dendro Kiori.
Lama Tsongkhapa continues, and after death, you will not cease to exist. So again, this is the point that's been made previously. We will leave our body behind, but our consciousness will continue to our new rebirth. Our consciousness will arise within a new body. Lama Tsongkhapa continues, you must take rebirth, and rebirth can only be in one of two directions, as is about to be covered, either remaining in the higher realms or falling to the lower realms. There are only those two directions.
On the young so, Jazan Androli Kiwa Lemba in the Dendroli Kiwa in Bana, Kawa Kiwa and the Dian Kiwa Lemba, the Ram agents, Ram Yomaris, so that machine Onga Kiwa Chimang, Dendroli Kiwa in Laya Maris, Sally Kiggins in the Kia, so Raman Kaya Maris, Ram Yabazan and the Kadi says, Legi Shamares, Jazan Legi Shamachi in Bay, she's a Legi Shamachi, Le Karasab in Migi will lay Saban, a lady wonking Androli Kido, Mato, Mangandroli Kigime, Dendroli King Laya Maris. So le Kawa Mambo Sabana, di King Yong in Dendroli Kido, the Legi Shamachares, said Delia Machine Yanzuki Le Kade Yagat Sabin, Digian, and Shamariches, Le, you Kawa Yaposana, Tebo Dendroli Kigre, you Migawa Mangosana, di Tebo, and Androli Kigres, the Legi Shamachares.
Lama Tsongkhapa, since apart from the two, there is no other place of birth, you will be born in either the fortunate rebirths or the lower rebirths. So these are the only directions every ordinary being can go in. And Lama Tsongkhapa continues, in addition, since you are not under your own control, but under the control of something else, your karma. So this too was looked at in the previous chapter, that when our death comes, all that will accompany us are our imprints. All that we strove to acquire, our relationships, our material possessions, will be left behind. But the imprints we accumulated while striving to build up these relationships or acquire these possessions, those imprints will accompany us. And this is the karma that is being referenced here. Your karma, under the control of something else, your karma, you will be reborn according to the virtuous and non-virtuous karma that impels you. And this then is that key point, that if you have accumulated extensive virtue in this life, then you can have confidence when death comes. A further excellent rebirth will follow. If you haven't accumulated an extensive amount of virtuous karma, you have no real basis for such confidence. Then you really are moving to your next life blind, not knowing what lies before you.
le kana ge jidar phangpa shin ge wo se jidar phangpa shin jizanda phangpa se de yu sha ba se ko pe na ju na do chi yu ba na do di capsule dry yel dry yel dry do khon la ramas khay mar na la pa mi gi yel yu shan ko do di ye shol dro ne ma sa ya re yel ba yu shan ne yel ba yu shol ba dro ne sa ya re ma do khon la ram me do yu he mi de la ga mi de ga yu che go ba di na shin ga zu ke wa len ba de le dian zhe de ge da nga de ge la nga zu le ram yo ma ji de le ka na de ga yu she ba na ga bi le yu she ba ne dian zhe de ge yong re nga de le yu she ba le di bi le yu she ba yu ba na nga de le ge yong re je zam de she ka na ge ji de phang ba shin ga de yu ba na de le ge re se ge.
The second last word, the end of this paragraph, the word impel. This is our situation. Our karma is in control. We are not. We go where our karma dictates. We are in fact no different from a stone being thrown, in that a stone has no choice over whether it will be thrown, when it will be thrown, what direction it will be thrown, or in what it lands. It goes where it's impelled to go. We are in that same position. Our karma dictates our rebirth. Our karma dictates whether we remain in the high realms or whether we are impelled to the lower realms. We have no choice. Moreover, what circumstances we take our rebirth in, that is not in our control. Our karma dictates that too. And the various events that we encounter in that new rebirth, that too is not in our choice. It is impelled on us, forced upon us, under the control of our karma.
Karesene givile sabane sosu semi tendo chagore migivile shabane sosu semi tendo chagore chesa dini sa semdi dus ka thobene le nibadi fa dugo baza an del ba ke wale de cha dugo ba dini sa da nganzu samda ben da nganzu ge da givile semdi nganzu ge da showene nganzu chi chi nye ge de ba chi nye ge de ba chi nye da ya Sangelia, Conjolia, Debachia, Shirley Debacha, and Denisi Sembeda, Chichua Metaba sometime, or that Dene that the Chinyam and Chihudo Assembly sometimes as an Gavacha, Rwada, Dina Dine that Anzugi, Givili, Gavacha Gorba.
What's presented here we have already covered. So as mentioned previously too, it's our karma that dictates our rebirths. Our karma impels us, if it's virtuous that's dominant, to remain in the high realms. And if it's non-virtuous that's dominant, we cannot complain. We cannot insist on going where we want. We will go to the lower realms. This needs to be seen very clearly, because we live under the illusion of having freedom, of having independence, of being in control of our lives, when we are not. Our karma determines what we encounter, and our habituation through these karmic imprints determines what our spontaneous reaction is. Having an understanding of desired outcomes, of wanted circumstances, we then need to see that those circumstances only come about under the control of our karma. Therefore, we need to accumulate the required virtuous imprints.
Nisa dangana zule gidi na samla mata dukapchi mer badanga zule samla gidi na ni ya ni sebe kapla ne samla tangore ni khube kapla na samla ni ge sheba de khorju gore chesa samla mata be kap kyune me bare chesa me ba za dangana zuge le ma sa be ge kap kyune me bare chere le ma sa be du se kyune me chago ma chesa da le sa le de ya ndibe le dan ge le dan dene karsore Lumadingile said Gavile, Migivile, Lumadingli, said Sumdu Yawachigore. Says an Lumadingile said Kawaya Mare, Miguel Mare, called Liagas and Digi, Mazuki, Lumadingile, Dio, Korean, Chico Koaliki, 차기가 말 대화주에 차두고 말 그런 레시사고 그런 지부지 요도 연구할 때이 롱마딩 레시오라. 다들 미기 웰레스야 돼. 롱마딩 레시야 되게 레디기 제부대 나서 디포기고 가서 동아 용화지 연구하고 제부 동아 연구하고 말해. 제부 디기 대화야 연구하고 말해. 제부 대화도 동아 가야 마인비 이제 지 제부 용화셔로와 레데레데 롱마딩 레시오라. 진짜 당하는 중에 섬나리아 다 미기 웰레스야 되다 지 되자 가서 컨트롤당 가자라서 봐 되게 도시는 개발이나 다 미기 웰레 디수기 제부들 동아 기고래 동아 연구하래 해시래. 다 개와서야 돼. 나중에다 지게 지마 삼다야 추림 삼 니니주에 지금에 선배섬 추림 송야라서 받아 현리야 잠바다 이제 샘래 펜베 삼러 다야 루스 데니스 기바나 데니스 개와자 디기 되고 아니 대화도 연구를 해야지. 그래서다 레디라 기회래다 미기회래 데네 롱마디기래 세지 남자들 뭐 숨치고래. 그래서 데네 자다 가서 가블레 기회래 사고 가블레 미기회래 사고 가블레 롱마디기래 사고다.
Especially as meditators, you're aware that your mind is always active. Other than when we are in the deepest of sleep, our mind is constantly active. Therefore, karma is constantly being accumulated. In karma, there are only three types: virtuous, non-virtuous, and neutral. Neutral does not lead to ripening effects of happiness or suffering. Non-virtuous, which is accumulated by our afflicted mind, such as attachment, anger, and so forth, only lead to suffering. Whereas virtuous karma, which is accumulated through wholesome minds, such as love, compassion, ethics, and generosity, leads only to happy circumstances, desired circumstances. So this mind that is constantly active is constantly creating these imprints, and these imprints are only of these three types.
어디네서 당을 저기 치 개와치마 안송 조조선 안조다 된도 이기는데 안조 줘야 돼 가르려야 돼 안조기 내사디 내수디 신고야디 개침벌 해서 안조 써야 돼. 당 안조 써야 되네 냐와 있다 둔조 숨셔도 냐와 예 야는 냐와 개와 야는 둔조를 개와 야는 안에 이달을 개와야 돼. 디수마도 매래. 진짜 냐와 있다 둔조 숨지 개고 그래서 진짜 네 내수디 야고 신고야디 개침벌 해서 되네 시바이나 그냥 저기 사지들 룸버들 마로니엘이야 룸버들이 내상으로 시다 안에 지게 강아 가르가르 요래 안에 지게 가르가르 요래서 하고 봐이나 델야 안에 지게 다들 하나 주기를 랑화유대로와 진짜 룸베딜로 줘다 마저 사지 타셔지는 소소 랑화유대 바래 진짜 룸베디 내수신 룸베델야 튕기에 강아 주의 강아 넘시 강아 되니게 답변 요라서 강아 유바 되는 쉬어 하고나 어당아디 죽음에 SB 데 마저야게 아니 룸베 샨다디 제 내타 야가들 줘야게 담가시 두고 봐. 데 룸베디 내타다 하 먹어봐나 나 먹어진 내타 균에 하 먹어나 내가 조금의 선비게 내가 파유에게 탑시거나 지금 말봐. 마지막자다 저는 림바들 레슨받는 강한 요야 차기로 어비디나시 다다가서 마신이랑 다다가서 라와 차사 요레스 제자다 냐와라 조우디에 마손 조우디 된조 조가디 다다가서 탑시 제기 고갑 담가체 예대 바래. 그래서는 데니기 제자 개호주야 예대 받아. 지여봐자 제자 데니자다 마송게 깨와네 가르가르가르 강아지게 두시네 가르가르 내타디게 하고 와지 다 하고 봐도 오다 데네데 걔네데 뺏사사데 지금에 걔네데 강아시 우체사리 선배 삼로코도 딜레기에 마게게 탑람디 베주시 용으로 봐 데네 상안줄이야 두시네 고합 야고 열반자 데데네 두시네 니엘이야 나는 가서는 마지 니엘이 당아주기 나송에 내상 가르가르 여바디 하고 가야 돼 개체무시 우리에서 하 먹어봐 있나 나중에 가서 딜레 타야게 탑람 그런 베주시고 말데 베주 맞아봐 있나 말에서는 되네 강아 책이래서 제가 다들 나송에 내상디기 봐 하고 가야 돼 개체무시 우리에서 그래.
So recognizing that our mind is constantly active and therefore constantly accumulating karma, and the karma is only of those three types. At the very least, we must ensure we avoid coming under the influence of the afflictions and thereby creating non-virtuous karma, the karma that will lead to rebirth in the lower realms. So as to aid us in the development of this determination not to create the causes for suffering, not to be deceived by the afflictions any further, we move into this new chapter. Because if there are only two directions we can go in, the higher realms and the lower realms, the reason we start the presentation of the lower realms is because there's an urgency that we must not create the causes for rebirth there. This must be our primary objective, not to create the causes to be born in the lower realms. So the lower realms consist of three types: those of animals, those of spirits and pretas, and those of the hells. If we come to understand those three rebirths well, and come to recognize the intensity of the suffering, the hopelessness of one's situation when born there, we strengthen our determination not to accrue the causes to be reborn there. We strengthen the determination to no longer be deceived by the afflictions. So to develop this strength of mind, we need to understand the suffering that is experienced in each of those realms. The suffering that may arise from the environment, the suffering that arises from the physical body there, the suffering that arises mentally for beings there. Through recognizing this well, understanding this well, this adds to our determination to utilize this precious human rebirth well. This rebirth that we recognize we have the capacity to have a deep influence, to take control over our future, to create the causes not to be born in the lower realms, to no longer create non-virtue, but just virtue. So this knowledge of the lived experience of beings in the lower realms, this lived experience that may well be ours again, leads to strengthening our determination to avoid non-virtue and to embrace virtue. So therefore, the gathering of the knowledge of what is being experienced in the lower realms and may potentially await us leads to the strengthening of our determination to fulfill our capacity, to not let this opportunity of a precious human rebirth, which is so impermanent, not to let it go to waste.
Da su su ngā rā sam tāme nā ngā rā da jika kāre chīk tu sam tāme da ngā rā kāng su ni da dīkba chē sā ya de kāpri li ngā rā khōrā lā ya da de su su nō rī chā ne jika khōrā lā ya lā sōpa da dīni ki chā tā lā sōpa yung kō rā de ina da kāng su ni dīni ki chē de shirā pīsū chi ni jīgyō mār mē sa dīni ki tō ni ngā rā du su su ngā rā sam tāme da de dīkba nyū rō shi shiandā chi ne dīkba nyū rō chi rō da jina dīkba sā kō rā de ina jizē ki dīkba shūk chīmbo shū da pē jik saayade shirā nyūnyūrwa. Tā dēne yinzā, tā ngā zhūki sūsūrāngā samtāme, tā ngā rā samtāme, tā ngā rā zhūki jiki ngā chū nyaya tā, jik ngā zhūki gēwā chūbiyā gōm jaya lā sūpa, yāngsī jigōrwa, dī shasā ngā zhūki gēwā chagōrwa tā, shasā tā ngōndiyo gōpā tōyā ki yu chaya tā, nē ngōndiyo tēnlā dīgī chūbiyā tā, dēne ki shasā dūshene chādhūgōrwa. Dēne yinzā samtāme, sūsūrāngā samtāme, oda zemli deli ya nyokta sabo shu che kanga chik dene shi redi kabli ya nga zo dene ki chik chuen nyamlen kala kanga sam che tuwa di pe ma si da chik tsa chenpo shu da shivu chik cha yo ma inza susurarang o dingi dene shewa di pe yaku chung sha yaku du sempe ki da nga susurarang rang ya ane chu bobo ki ya da rang ki da du shi ne an dene yi dene shi ne mutu ne che tuwa chingin sempe samdang wa di ma zo ki chenpo cha korwa.
The very least, what we need to do is not accumulate non-virtue with awareness or intentionally. By being aware of our mind, when we see anger arises, take control. Don't follow through on that anger. Don't let it influence your behavior or speech. Likewise with attachment. When you see attachment arising, don't follow through on that. In this way, you start to reduce the non-virtue that you accumulate. Non-virtue will still be accumulated, but then it will be restricted to the times when one isn't mindful, when one's afflictions are dominant, but one is not aware of it, and one accumulates non-virtue. But at least one is reducing the non-virtue that one accumulates. And as one gains skill even if one's not mindful, when the afflictions become strong, that will wake you up, and you'll recognize that. And even though the afflictions are dominant, you'll restrain yourself. So in this way, you can, at the very least, reduce the accumulation of powerful non-virtue. And it's the powerful imprints that propel our rebirth. So if we can at least avert the accumulation of powerful non-virtue, this will help greatly reduce the chances of falling to the lower realms. Moreover, through this understanding, one wants to not only avert the accumulation of non-virtue or reduce how much we accumulate, but increase the virtue that we accumulate. This comes through listening to teachings, taking inspiration back to how we live our lives, and engage in intentional acts of virtue, such as meditation, making offerings, prostrations, and so forth. So this one needs to do, and do in the way that's been described, because you can take confidence that this is the method all the great teachers have engaged in, and therefore it is effective. And moreover, in our daily life, we do observe tremendous suffering in the world. Perhaps in your own life, but hopefully not. But certainly what one observes in the world, beings do endure tremendous suffering. Recognize that that has come about in dependence on causes, and commit to determining, I will not create such causes, and rejoice in this recognition. And if your life, certainly compared to what others are having to endure, is much better, rejoice in that, because this is an expression of the karma that you have accumulated. Rejoice in your own endeavors. And this is important. We need to be positive about ourselves, to recognize our successes, because this will spur us on to continue to do so. Whereas if we become overwhelmed by negativity, or we feel weak and diminished, then we will not fulfill our capacity. So recognize actually how truly fortunate I am compared to so many others. This shows, by having applied myself in past lives, I've accumulated the causes for this great outcome, that I am so fortunate. Therefore, I know I can continue to do so in this life, and not be deceived by feeling that we are weak or insignificant.
semjen suebigi digba di ngason la kie gi digba jeba la digba de top chembo chko shuk chembo men digba semje sueba samgi ane karasore ngason la kie gi le di chago ma nyuba yo ma ye tu yo ma re jere bena azu ge semje buru chi ga zu ya je nyuba ki de pare lo khong chi je kon la je chi sue sha ba na de sue ba ba da sue sa ba da ra de deng yi sue ne da ding yi sue sa de ji so san be sam da ba ne digba che cha go re 제네 직부로 쇠사바는 하면서 당에 직 콘란의 쇠샤바이네 쇠쇠에 다하는 지소마선 비빠라들이야 어다 뺏어서 다 거시서 닝제 선배 당에 넣어서 닝제 선배 삼다베네 디 심전 수비 디바디 부직 수비 디바 사이고르데 이나 디기 냐월게 가선리게기 뉴바요 말데라 대자다 데네 심전데 콜라 콘란 콘르군이랑 코베스 직수고 선배 수는 직수 수에네다 수에 사회실 땅에 수에 사서 거 직소한 비기 되네 삼다베네 디 수비 디버디기 나설기에게 레차고래 차고래 제자다 제장 안소에게 디버 심전 수비 디버디기 나설기 디버사발라 심제의 수에의 군농 균마셔 군농시고 거래 되네 수비게 자와치고래 수고거래 제 수에 세회 제리야 땅에 직소한 거 수에 사서 직소한 비기다 되네게 삼라시 땅고 거래 되네 삼라도 직 군로다 아니 자와다 누수에 체비 젤이야 안지 뒤수와서 비게 삼도 되니시게 베나 단 부수에 비게 디바디 단 안설게 디바로 차고래
As you've heard, and we will continue to see, the cause for being reborn in the lower realms is non-virtue. It's that and that alone. And a very clear illustration of non-virtue is that of killing. So here, we'll come a little later to the presentation on karma, but this is good to hear now and keep in mind that killing, for example, animal life, killing animals, that certainly can have the capacity to lead to rebirth in the lower realms, but it's not definite that it will. In particular, if one is developing qualities in the Dharma, then it becomes ever more unlikely that such non-virtue will lead to rebirth in the lower realms. So to be clear, killing of animals is non-virtuous, and it can lead to rebirth in the lower realms. The point that I'm making is it will not necessarily lead to rebirth in the lower realms, because the imprint that ripens at the time of death and propels a rebirth is a powerful imprint. It's not a minor imprint. So if one takes rebirth in the lower realms, that is because the time of death, a powerful imprint has ripened. So if one is reborn in the lower realms, it is due to exactly that, powerful non-virtue, not slight non-virtue. And again, whilst killing an animal can lead to the accumulation of a powerful imprint, and if it ripens at the time of death, will lead to rebirth in the lower realms. Key point is, not necessarily, especially if one is cultivating the Dharma within. Because, for example, if you as a practitioner, you lose your mindfulness and you respond habitually, and you kill an insect, for example, out of anger. Let's say it's a mosquito, it's annoying you, and you kill it. If your Dharma knowledge immediately ripens, you'll regret what you've done. And that non-virtue will weaken. Whereas perhaps earlier in your life, before you cultivated knowledge of the Dharma, when you killed that insect, it's a complete action, and then you rejoiced in it, finally it's not annoying me, that magnifies the strength of that non-virtue. But through your Dharma training, you're much more likely to have compassion, recognizing that all this mosquito wanted to do was drink some blood. It wanted to eat. That is all. And following its natural wishes, I killed it. In this way, regret ripens, and that weakens the non-virtue. And it will weaken it sufficiently that it lacks the strength to lead to rebirth in the lower realms. And when it ripens, it will ripen as a suffering experience, not as the propelling karma leading to rebirth in the lower realms. For a karma to have sufficient strength to lead to rebirth in the higher or lower realms, it needs to be a complete action. And this has components. One needs to have a motivation to do so. So this can be an intentional motivation or an unintentional motivation, but it needs a motivation. It requires duration. So in other words, so this motivation needs to have a certain strength. So it needs to be abiding within one for a period of time to give it that strength. And then the second component is there needs to be some kind of preparation. And the third is the performance of the action. And the fourth, it has been brought to completion or to fruition. So these are the 4 steps that are required. And then, if all that is complete, it may lead to a rebirth. But if any of them are missing, it will not. And if that complete action is weakened through, for example, regret or purification, it is not going to lead to rebirth in the lower realms.
Dine zada nga zhe Gabriel ya khonra sa da shen le su she da Gabriel nga dine ki jik di fa sa ba chi yungurwa dine ki Gabriel ya lamsang nga zhe oda di che sewe che la oda nge di che de pe no sha che ya chu ma so ma ba na za wa ni chi me san bi ge sam ta sha we na dine ki nga zhe khonra zan di fa chu chu ke yar de na di ba di ni wa sha be di ba di chu chu cha go che za dine zada nga zhe sem je ji Gabriel Sevata, Shanlia, and the Controlaya, that Six of Shevata, Dinigi Chumba in Lamsa, or that Nedis on some of somebody, or that Lamsa, or that digging North on Timason, that Gemani, the Jigme, some big, some die the Chimuchagor, in Chavan, Sosuki, Divar Savin, the Tibachuma Chagorova, or Dusin. Dede kulongo se goro de kulon da dandala endi se du kulon yo marwa di yo marwa da kulongo se goro de ne so was me kulongo ne goro de ne da de ne so go yo se kulongo se me ne shina ga yo mar se be nangme che sha ban di go mar da o de ne shina ga yo mar se be sam da shan di go mar 진짜 donda nimbo de ngon je kabrelia dene khona sa da simju se bala so yungure de ine dene kabrelia namsa oda de gi ma so nor so dene mawo ban de jingme a sem be sam da ge chi sho de se de dine da dine gap de dos chune shu shan de go.
Just to first correct the mistake as translator made in the previous segment. For an act to be complete, motivation is required, but that motivation needs to be intentional. An act is always motivated, but that motivation can be unintentional, and therefore a complete action will not be created. And the action not being complete cannot lead to a propelling karmic imprint being created. Now to come what Geshe has just presented. So through these teachings, you are being encouraged to incorporate the Dharma into your daily life, in particular, to be mindful, to be aware of your thought process, and thereby guard your mind from coming under the influence of the afflictions, but rather to keep your mind always virtuous. By doing so, you will avoid accumulating non-virtue, because if your mind is not afflicted, you will not accumulate non-virtue. But also, if you either don't know, your mindfulness is lacking and you don't notice the arisal of an affliction, or you notice it, but it dominates, and you end up acting under the influence of the afflictions. Then, with your mindfulness, you will be aware, I've just created non-virtue, and you will regret that. Which means, even though you've created non-virtue, for example, the mosquito came, it was annoying, and you thought, doesn't matter the consequences, and you kill it, the regret then will arise. And even though it was an intentional non-virtuous act, the regret will weaken it. So this, of course, by no means excuses, or this by no means is a skillful way to engage in non-virtue. But by being mindful and immediately regretting our behavior, in this way we can purify. So by being mindful throughout our day, we serve to both reduce the non-virtue that we accumulate and purify what we do make. And the final point to make here is that the reality is, as ordinary beings, our afflictions will continue to arise. We'll get annoyed with people, frustrated, even angry. But by training, those afflictions will ripen less often. When they do ripen, we'll be less inclined to follow them. And when we do follow them, we'll be much more quickly, we'll recognize that fault and we'll remedy it. This is how we will change our way of thinking. It's through this process that we'll weaken our habituation to the afflictions, strengthen our habituation to wholesome ways of thinking. So for an affliction to arise, it's not necessary for us to express it. We may get angry at someone, but if we recognize that anger, we can calm it immediately and not express it to the other person. So the arisal of an affliction doesn't necessarily mean we need to act upon it. By being skillful, that can be averted. And I want to emphasize this point again, because not only should we purify our non-virtue when we accumulate it, but it's imperative you recognize the virtue that you accumulate and rejoice in it. This is very important to overcome any issues with low self-esteem, looking down on oneself, not really recognizing one's capacity. All of this is overcome by recognizing your good qualities, recognizing when virtue has arisen, recognizing when you've acted with a good intent, and rejoicing not only serves to amplify the virtue accumulated, but it encourages one to continue to do so, and it helps you to see yourself in a more positive light. This is important. So I encourage you to take the time to look at your good qualities, to recognize where virtue arose, wholesome minds arose, and where you acted under their influence. So then we can conclude here for the weekend, but if you have any questions that weren't answered earlier, then by all means, feel free to ask. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's not particularly related, but it's about karma writing. And if someone harms us and we don't forgive them, like I understand that if we forgave them, that would cut that karmic consequences of us like retaliating in future life or then receiving that same harm. But if we don't forgive them, I'm wondering, do we somehow have a kind of driven in a future life to harm that perpetrator in the same way?
That Pashogi di Sul Nevakina, Pasevo Matubadi, di Sevo Matuba, some yeti dipacha Marwa. The Sevo Matubaji, Palayan, Janjik, Samlong and Bata, Dujacho or some content, some down, Nevaki, some down, and then the dipacha Gormado. Sevo Matuba, some rather dipaska Chagumara, Sunevina. The Soso Magiba Chungurua. So the Pechik, Sevocoma, so my giver, Shungurity, di Paranchas Kayamarwa. That the nigger Sevocoma, which Palia Anchik never get some not down when they did some no did that nearly some died, some no did Chagrua.
So just the first part of the answer. So just actually to say it's an aside, because this forgiveness, it's not such a word present in Tibetan. They use a version of the word for patience. So I'll talk with Geshe a little further. But thus far, he says that when someone acts towards you in an unkind manner or an unwanted manner, merely through not being patient, in other words, through one's mind remaining undisturbed, you do not necessarily accumulate non-virtue. So by at least restraining yourself at that time, but your mind is affected, it's not that you necessarily create non-virtue by not being patient. Yeah?
Is that these also might give a charm of the party, some of Patnevia, some Dangoma, did Dipaska Chagomare. So might give a Yunguru out in Kongal, tenacious or tenacious or these social changes, socially never the some done, so might give a Yungurua. Did Dipaska Marua, so might give it. That the nigger sometimes soon never something all tenacious or near part in the cheese and be some time never some time and that sometimes Dipachagrua. 디고 말해 디고 말해 콘진 이제 콘진게네 콘진세야 된 마음 반응이 퀄리티 지기 아니고 지기야서 삼로냐 돼도 콘진식으로 와. 이 콘진에 디바샤게.
And even if you hold on to what was said or done to you, and for some years, if all you're doing is remembering it and your mind is becoming unhappy, then you are experiencing unhappiness, but you are not accumulating non-virtue. But if when you recall what was said or done, what you have not forgiven, if you then give rise to harmful intent or resentment, so a negative attitude towards that person, that's different. Then one is wanting, almost wanting something harmful to happen to that person. Kind of like if something else happens to them and my revenge is enacted in that way, then I'll be pleased. Now, this way of thinking, that is non-virtuous. But if you merely remember what has been done and you're still hurt by it, all that's happening is you're being hurt. You're not accumulating non-virtue.
So I'm wondering more about whether in a future life, if you have that non-forgiveness, like resentment, would that propel you to harm them in the same way in a future life, just through that karmic imprint?
내가 치마 뇌비게 내봐요 말아 뇌투에게 소수의 권진 제대로 내가 치마야 아직 투베나 남자 뇌투기를 발 뇌비기에서 뇌투에게 내봤을까요 말에 이게 전에 미팅 봐 차야 용시 봐래 아도 인비 내봐요 말에.
So then, if you do have, for example, resentment or harmful intent against this person, and that you haven't forgiven and you've accumulated in this way non-virtue, if you meet again in a future life, it is not at all certain that you will then harm them in response or as a ripening effect of that resentment. That is not at all certain. What is much more likely is that your relationship will not be great. The relationship will not be immediately warm and friendly, but there'll be an apprehension or a disharmony. That is much more likely. But that you will necessarily harm that person, that same person, because of the resentment, that is not at all certain.
So they are likely to get their karmic retribution through a non-means in a future life.
So the person who, for example, spoke badly to you, that non-virtue that they accumulated won't necessarily be ripened through you, but it could come in another way.
말해. 공기 조설해야 디퍼시 디베티브도 코로나 미마도 코로나 미에스가요 말와. 근데 코로나 맞기와도 코로나 강아지 용 맞도 결혼기 콜린데 어제도 용 말와. 예, 이러. 그런 게 디버도 그런 가와도 그런 제부 그런 민마도 결혼 게 söyleyecek 말와 그런 걸로 지기로 와.
So that is very unlikely. That is very unlikely. So unlikely you'd say it wouldn't happen. That if, let's say, there's a bad relationship between two people, that will karmically necessarily play out between those same two people in the future. That is very unlikely. Because we carry our own non-virtuous imprints. They will ripen if not purified, but they won't necessarily ripen in relation to the person through whom we originally created them. So, for example, if that the person who spoke to you unkindly, if that non-virtue they created ripens as a propelling karma at their time of death and they fall to the lower realms, you had nothing to do with that ripening at the time of their death. What ripened at the time of death was a negative imprint that they had accumulated. And it ripened without your presence, a direct or indirect presence at all. So therefore, the ripening of this karma is highly unlikely to involve the ongoing interplay between the individuals. Okay. Sure, at the back.
I'm just trying to sort out something. This morning we talked about not getting carried away with the pleasures of this life and the various miseries because they don't get you anywhere. Over-engaging in pleasures and over-emphasising negative circumstances. And this afternoon it's about trying to create positive imprints and negative imprints. Is there any implication or inference in there that we shouldn't engage in sort of activities or discussions about worldly events or enter into, community politics or something because it's a waste of time or it'll disturb our mind, or because sometimes you feel compelled and, the compassion side, whatever, you think, well, if I don't engage in that, something wrong is going to happen. Not to say that your mind, you can necessarily control your mind all the way through it, so positive all the way through it. So I'm just wondering Geshe's opinion on engaging in certain activities, or was there an implication that we narrow down our activities in order to keep the mind right?
And just to be clear on your question, are you talking about events around one, but that one cannot really have a direct influence? They're also elsewhere in the world as opposed to something right before you. Because that's a bit different. There's one where you can have an impact and there's one where you cannot, but the mind is engaging.
I'm probably confusing the two.
Well, if it's about one or the other, then I'll ask it in that way.
Well, definitely about the one where you can have an impact.
Where you can.
But also when you hear about world news and children being harmed, where you can't do much other than give money, but you feel like you need to do something. Should you just shrivel up?
Okay.
Zengyu la soba dine tong de gabla dine gi jike ganga be jik tong de da phasho de ya dine gabla yang samda di nyamlen yabu jar tu ba ne da be yabu ra di 가서 생기된 내서 통해도 다시 부 밑에 보고다 되는 시에도 인제 다 건서 강화 되는 시에도 시월에 인제서 미주 검야래 안 되는게 파쇼게 천자 요소겐 미디게래나 아 되는 시간들 아 인제 건서다 녀모 봐 샤원도 소지 라메 봐 되는 시 인제 아 선배게 니가래야 편지 니가래 인제 삼 공부이나 되는 소소기 소소기 냠래야고 차고래 되는게 삼로 땅 인제 삼땅 후배나 생규제 따바이네 지고래 되니게 삼다데 마토와제 판이 부디게 서야 닝제 다 쇠간디게 빼 두자래 미 마라비오 콘소파직 네베기오라 삼다바네 디 삼로디기 아니 냥 소소 삼로나라 디바시데 요디 삼 데네 삼로 코고에나 데네 닝제게 마도바네 데 네소도 많이네 야로 책으로와 그래서 데네에서다 소소기 예홀리 나다 강아디기 통로도 갑라 소수가 닝제 소수가 로고 강투 제투베네 제마도베나 소수가 삼문에 닝제 다 콘도도신 다 강아 체간들레 닝제 강아 체간들레 녀모베 샹화도 손에 제발 닝제 산비게다 고 도신에 닝지 공바이나 야쇼디레 생주콜레 예홀레네 생예홀레 마디버르시네 아니 강강아제 미니 투보자 지기지래 강아제 그거베나 다 강아 용서기 내겐 강아 체세 미들에 닝제다 코르디네 강아 용 닝제세 닝주고미하다 강아 제게 미데 오다 고녀모베 샤와스인데 디네기 진에 코 강아 지거 닝제세 닝주고바이나 소수게 무슨 판도 제투베는 무슨 라렌다다 무슨 판도 지마도는 무슨 닝주고바이나 근데 디네 소수게 와서 그 냠는 자르고 그래 디네게 닝주고마도 바제 빼 파쇼들 빼 둑자레디 폴바네베 기고레세메 삼다베나디 Here
you need to look very carefully at your mind and honestly at your mind, because when to start with looking at world events or watching the news, but much of that relates to something in your actual life. It's very easy for one to watch these events in the life and have compassion arise within and believe that therefore this is a virtuous thing I'm doing because compassion is arising within me. So engaging with the news, with the events of the world has this benefit because compassion is arising within. But what is much more likely, as beginners, we are responding in the way of ordinary people, not of an actual practitioner. With the difference being, an ordinary person will watch these events and they'll see a victim, and for the victim, compassion will arise. And they'll see a perpetrator and a harsh mind towards them will arise. That is the ordinary way of enacting. That is not the way a Dharma practitioner engages. So if your way of reacting is like the first, where there is a friend and an enemy, then it's better not to engage, to stay away from those topics that lead to the arisal of this mind of discrimination between friend and enemy, where we create friends and enemies. An actual practitioner will view that same news report and equal compassion for both parties will arise, recognizing that both parties are acting without freedom. They are experiencing the ripening effects of their karma and being propelled by their afflictions. Whether it's a person acting the violence or receiving the violence, both are under the control of their karma. Both are therefore suffering with afflictions. So a genuine practitioner of the Dharma will have equal compassion for both and will not perceive one as the victim and another as a perpetrator, but recognize both equally as being victims of their karma and afflictions. So if that isn't your genuine response, then it's better rather not to watch, not to engage. And then in terms of events around you, then there it's very similar in that you need to take care of your mind. And if it's an event around you, then you may well need to get involved, but take care of your mind. Do not see one as a victim and one as the perpetrator. Recognize that they are playing out their roles, that their karma determines is difficult, but the meaning is that the karma determines. The karma is propelling them into this role, and they both are acting it out under the control of their karma. So what it really comes down to is you must watch your mind and see if something is aiding your practice or harming it, and be aware of the attachment that will draw you to what you find exciting and pleasurable. It may well actually be just the afflictions that you are deeply habituated to ripening, and therefore you take pleasure and comfort, but actually your mind is afflicted.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.